Hey guys, welcome to a new theory and explanation video. This one is all about the nature of the smoke monster, which means I'll be going over what some of his unique weaknesses are, as well as some of the abilities he has due to his specific state of existence. I also go over what I believe he went through immediately after becoming the smoke monster in order to kind of get into his headspace and how he went from a fairly normal person to this character who has absolutely no issue with killing anyone that gets in his way. I have talked in previous videos about some of what I think happened to the Man in Black between Across the Sea and when we next chronologically see him in the mid 1800s, namely his influence over the Egyptian culture that came to the island. I do kind of go over that again in this video, but this time with the goal of kind of getting in his head during that period. Now, before getting into the rest of the video, I did want to give a shout out and thank you to my new Patreon supporter, Brian Phillips, who has selected the candidate number 69. Brian has, of course, been added to my cave of candidates. Thank you again, Brian, for your support, and thank you to all of my other patrons who continue to support this channel. To everyone else, if you too would like to become a Patreon supporter, you can do so for as little as $1. Just one donation at the $4 level gets you a candidate number and added to the cave. But if you choose to sign up at the $1 level and you end up donating for 4 months, that obviously means you will have contributed $4. And so at that point, I will also offer you the option of being added to the candidate list. Now, that said, you don't have to donate anything in order to support this channel. Clicking the like button, leaving your feedback in the comments, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and sharing the channel with anyone you think might enjoy it. All of these are fantastic ways to support the channel that don't cost you anything besides maybe a few moments of your time. I did also want to give a quick channel update. The reason today's video is a little behind schedule is because this is the first theory and explanation video that I am not recording and editing on my phone. Instead, I am using a Mac that my brother has generously donated. And so getting used to the new editing program has been a bit of an adjustment, not to mention trying to get a lot of the footage that I've accumulated from the show over to this computer now. That certainly added a fair amount of time to the editing process. But the good news is, I think you'll agree that the video quality, starting with this video, is significantly improved. The only thing I'm a little worried about is the audio volume from clip to clip. I feel like I adjusted everything so that it's pretty level, but I know I've been wrong about that before. Anyways, in the long run, I think that this will actually drastically speed up the editing process and make it easier to get these videos out in a timely fashion. Right now, my plan going forward is to start releasing videos every other week. So on Wednesday, May 11th is when I'm planning on releasing the follow-up video for Hostile Takeover. And then 2 weeks after that, on May 25th, will be my next theory and explanation video. I believe I'll be able to stick to that schedule for the foreseeable future, certainly for the next couple of months. Now, while there won't be a new theory video or follow-up video next week, I am planning on releasing an updated channel introduction video. On my main channel page, there's an introduction video that I first made before any of my other lost videos, meant to introduce the idea behind these videos. I've been starting to feel that that original introduction video is kind of out of date, and I've been wanting to update it. So if you're already subscribed to the channel, you might get a notification next week that that video has gone up. Of course, if you're already familiar with this channel, you don't really need to be introduced to it. Basically, this video is just for anyone that is new to the channel, that hasn't seen any of my content before. So while you're more than welcome to check that out, you by no means need to. With all of that out of the way, let's get lost.
Just promise me, no matter what you do, you won't ever go down there.
Would I die?
It'd be worse than dying, Jacob. Much worse.
In the season 6 episode, Across the Sea, we see the Man in Black get tossed into the source and the events that led up to this.
I want to find the light. You want to leave this place, brother? Then go.
Throughout the rest of the series, we see him several centuries later and witness many features of his resulting state of existence. We also see this man, who once showed compassion for others, is now a mass murderer who no longer displays genuine empathy. What we don't see is the immediate aftermath of what happened to him. Because of this, it can be hard to fully appreciate the truly cruel and torturous existence the Man in Black had forced upon him.
He took my body, my humanity.
These circumstances and how they affected the psychology of the Man in Black, turning him from a flawed but decent man into a genocidal monster, are exactly what I want to talk about today, as well as the unique abilities and weaknesses his situation created for him. As discussed repeatedly in past entries, when the Man in Black was tossed into the source, his consciousness was apparently displaced from his body onto a force of energy and matter that resembles black volcanic smoke. This is not the only time we witness a large burst of this electromagnetic energy cause the displacement of consciousness. This is an effect we see in certain forms many times, Desmond being the most prominent example. But why black smoke? It has been noted previously on this channel that the showrunner's original intention for the location of the source was inside the island's volcano, which would have resulted in a final confrontation with the Man in Black against a backdrop of fire and ash. For many reasons, including budget constraints, this was later changed to the violent storm we now know. But even within the existing show, the source's connection to this volcano seems to remain implied. As we see after Desmond removes the stone plug, the cave fills with steam and a hellish glow, as if lava is beginning to bubble up to the surface as the island begins to sink. With this connection to the volcano in mind, it seems plausible that the Man in Black's fall into the unfiltered source could have triggered a sudden release of volcanic smoke in addition to the burst of energy, at which point the mind of the unconscious Man in Black was displaced from his body onto this energy and smoke. What happened immediately after this is pretty open to speculation. For my part, I imagine it was many years, perhaps decades or even centuries, before the Man in Black was able to successfully recreate his physical form. For anyone familiar with the graphic novel Watchmen, one of Damon Lindelof's biggest inspirations for Lost, perhaps the character of Dr. Manhattan is a good reference for what I imagine the Man in Black went through at this stage of his existence.
The light is taking me to pieces. It's November. It's November 10th now. There's a circulatory system walking through the kitchen. November 14th. Really, it's just a question of reassembling the components in the correct sequence.
But unlike the scientist, John Osterman, the Man in Black would not have had a comprehensive, modern understanding of human anatomy. And the process of figuring out how to manipulate and restructure his form on a molecular level may have taken several lifetimes. The fact he was able to do this at all is quite impressive. If not for his previously established parapsychological gifts, I'm not sure he could have done so. Eventually, though, he does succeed, regaining some semblance of his humanity back after what I believe was an unfathomable amount of time in that horrific state of existence. There must have been some relief in this victory before discovering the next devastating reality of his current circumstances. This force of energy he had become displaced onto was only capable of operating within the electromagnetic field of the source that was generating it. In other words, he was confined to the electromagnetic perimeter of the island, unable to reach his lifelong goal of escape, at least not while the source remained active. As discussed fully in this channel's Underworld video, I believe the Egyptian settlers that arrived on the island came to worship the smoke monster, in no small part due to its apparent ability to bring forth the spirits of the dead. I believe over the course of several generations, this culture completed his donkey wheel, built a temple to worship him, created at least one chamber which could be used to summon him, constructed a vast series of underground tunnels, and most importantly, experimented on the source in an effort to free him from its hold. Even when the Man in Black was a mortal, flesh and blood man, he did not hold humanity in high regard, and viewed them as little more than tools to use for his own ends.
They're greedy, manipulative, untrustworthy, and selfish.
And why are you with them?
They're a means to an end.
It's fair to say this opinion was only strengthened after becoming quite literally detached from the human condition. It is true that the Man in Black has the unique ability to accumulate the entirety of a person's memories, thoughts, and emotions.
You should know. He was very confused when you killed him. I'm talking about John Locke. Do you want to know what he was thinking while you choked the life out of him, Benjamin? What the last thought that ran through his head was? I don't understand.
Which could have created in the Man in Black a unique level of empathy for these other people. Indeed, one can imagine this potentially creating an interesting effect, in which these collected identities, each of which with their own conflicting wants and desires, may have made it difficult for the Man in Black to keep his sense of self. Yet, the only real hint of this we get in the series, besides certain mannerisms, is when the Man in Black yells Locke's signature catchphrase without a hint of irony.
Don't tell me what I can't do.
Don't tell me what I can't do!
After having just mocked this very behavior earlier that same morning.
Because when John first came to the island, he was a very sad man. A victim. Shouting at the world for being told what he couldn't do, even though they were right.
But all things considered, this is a pretty minor incident of confused identity. The reason I think the Man in Black does a pretty good job overall of avoiding these identity crises is because by the time he started replicating others, he had spent far longer than they had ever lived, completely alone in his awful state of existence. Meaning that even after downloading the entirety of what made someone else who they were, their hopes, their fears, and even their suffering all paled in comparison to his own. And as the centuries came and went, their lives would seem more and more fleeting and insignificant to the Man in Black, making it all too easy to disregard them entirely.
I don't understand. Isn't that just the saddest thing you ever heard? He was weak and pathetic and irreparably broken.
Which is why I believe by the end of the Egyptians' presence on the island, he had subjected them to many atrocities, including using them as slaves and guinea pigs in his experiments with the electromagnetism. Anyways, it is these experiments that I think resulted in the source ultimately becoming dependent on the stone plug. At which point Jacob, who had long avoided confronting the cruel fate he had condemned his brother to, finally felt he needed to step in. At last, he reconcealed the cave from his brother, the way Mother once had, preventing the Man in Black from being able to free himself from the source.
I spent 30 years searching for that place you brought me as a child, that waterfall with that beautiful light. And I've walked this island from end to end, not once coming close to finding it.
I'm sure Jacob tried to explain that he couldn't allow the countless deaths that would result from the light being extinguished, even if this meant keeping his brother permanently imprisoned. And perhaps he even went so far as to state he also needed to protect the outside world from the monster his brother had become. It's not hard to imagine the fury the Man in Black would have felt in this moment. Jacob had condemned him to this awful fate to begin with, and he was now betraying him once again to protect these people. These sinful, insignificant, unworthy people. Protecting them the way he should have protected his own brother. And in so doing, he was knowingly choosing to keep the Man in Black in this eternal hell without even death as a release. Fueled by this rage, I think the Man in Black then massacred every Egyptian that remained on the island, specifically despite Jacob and the compassion he had shown for these people. Compassion the Man in Black felt he had been denied. While the Man in Black's actions over the course of the series are arguably irredeemable, it's not hard to imagine how anyone in his circumstances might have become the same type of monster. By having the empathy he lacked, we can appreciate the tragedy of his fall without excusing his appalling acts. Now that we've gone over what makes Smokey tick, so to speak, let's talk about what his capabilities and weaknesses are, starting with the weaknesses. Generally speaking, the Man in Black's lack of an authentic flesh and blood form makes him invulnerable to conventional weapons. Though it is worth noting, the force of a dynamite explosion, detonated inside his cloud of particles and energy, did seem to temporarily disorient him somewhat. But while his condition makes him distinctly resistant to what would normally be lethal force, there are other limitations it creates for him. As already discussed, the smoke monster's unique connection to the island's source is what keeps him tethered to it. But I believe it is also what allows Jacob, the other master wielder of the island's energy, to place restrictions on what the monster can do. Primarily, preventing his brother from killing him and those he bestows with his life force. This, of course, creates many obstacles for the Man in Black and his goal of escape, as discussed more fully in this channel's previous video, Qualifying Candidates. For these reasons, I think it's fair to say that Smokey's attachment to the Source in and of itself is his biggest weakness. But there are a few others as well. At the temple and the cabin, we see ash placed around the perimeters for the apparent purpose of keeping the Man in Black out. We see this explicitly demonstrated in the Season 6 premiere when Bram quickly pours ash around himself and the monster is unable to cross it. But why does ash affect him this way? Well, as we previously went over, the source that is generating the force of energy that is the smoke monster is connected to the island's volcano. So if we presume that this is volcanic ash specifically, then it makes sense that this ash might give off electromagnetic interference that would repel the monster. That said, the temple massacre seems to indicate the ash on its own is not enough. Once Dogen has died, the monster is suddenly able to roam the entirety of the temple, paying no mind to the multiple ash boundaries that would still have remained.
You realize what you just did? He was the only thing keeping it out! Idiot! You just let it in!
Given this, I feel it is safe to conclude that the ash does not have a significant effect on the Man in Black, unless there is somebody on the other side with the ability to power it, so to speak. In other words, someone that is capable of harnessing the electromagnetic energy in such a way that they can generate the necessary amount of interference from the ash. Dogen's specific physiological response to the island's energy may have been one of the reasons he was chosen by Jacob for the position of Temple Master. Of course, the ash isn't the only thing we see repel the monster. The sonic fence around the barracks is the other clearly established smoke repellent. This may simply be caused by a sort of painful feedback the frequency creates within the cloud of consciousness, not dissimilar from the painful effect the fence has on the minds of the mere human characters. There is perhaps a third, more subtle example of something that repels the Man in Black in a similar way to the ash and the sonic fence, and that would be close proximity to large concentrations of electromagnetism, such as the source itself. Consider that once the Man in Black at long last regains access to the cave, thanks to Jack, he does not simply descend into the cavern to put out the light himself. Instead, he seems to need Desmond to do it for him.
Because I'm gonna find Desmond. And when I do, he's gonna help me do the one thing that I could never do myself. I'm gonna destroy the island.
This inability to get close to pockets of electromagnetism without experiencing adverse effects may explain why he is unable to help Locke to his feet in the Orchid Chamber.
Could you help me up? No. Sorry, I can't.
In fact, for this reason, he may not have been physically present at all, and instead astral projecting what Locke was seeing and hearing, which brings us to the Man in Black's strengths. In the A Shining Force video, we talked about the wide range of parapsychological abilities we see manifested in Lost. We also established that for virtually every one of these powers, there exists evidence to suggest the Man in Black possesses each of them to some degree. As a young boy and into adulthood, he exhibited several signs that he was already extremely gifted at harnessing the island's energy to manifest special abilities, perhaps more so than any other character in the show.
How do you know how? I just know.
I'll finally be able to leave this place.
How do you know all this? How do you know it will work?
I'm special, Mother.
After becoming more directly connected to the source of these abilities, followed by millenniums to grow and strengthen that power, It's safe to say the Man in Black's parapsychological prowess is nothing short of monumental. A great example of this is how he is able to telepathically extract information and memories from the people he encounters. While we are only able to witness this explicitly when he is in his smoke form, I strongly suspect this ability is not specific to that form, and that the Man in Black is quite often shown reading the minds of those he is interacting with in all of his manifestations. But what about the abilities that are specific to his existence as the smoke monster, such as shape-shifting? How does this work? Why is it in certain cases it's heavily implied he needs the actual corpse in order to replicate a person?
Why John Locke?
Because you were kind enough to bring his body back here in a nice wooden box.
He had to be dead before you could look like him.
That's right.
Whereas in other cases, he appears as someone whose body was never present on the island.
I saw her here, in this place. Where is she?
That wasn't your wife.
Yes, it was. She's dead, just like me.
And in yet more cases, it seems vaguely hinted that he may be appearing as people that are still living. The first thing we need to do is differentiate between the completely corporeal forms the Man in Black takes versus what are essentially just mental projections. The way I see it, once the Man in Black finally succeeded in reconstructing his physical form with the help of his own corpse, it wasn't long before he realized he could do the same thing with any creature whose body he could take and replicate down to the molecular level. But why can't he do this with living creatures? Well, I think he can. Only they won't survive this process as he breaks down their very DNA. So the reason he can't take Locke's form while he's still alive isn't exactly because he's incapable of replicating the living, but more accurately, it's because to replicate him while he's still alive would be to kill him. And we know the Man in Black is not allowed to kill John because he's a candidate. Once he has successfully copied a person, though, he is then able to assume their form perfectly, meaning he can appear 100% physically present in that form, able to be interacted with by anyone or any group that comes across him. There are other cases, however, in which something a bit different is happening. In these cases, if a person is in a mentally vulnerable state, the Man in Black can mentally project sensory information to that individual. The dreams in which the Man in Black is able to communicate with people are probably the best example of this. The recipient being unconscious constitutes the required mentally vulnerable state. Perhaps the best waking example, though, is what happens with Richard inside the shipwrecked Black Rock. After several days without food or water, Richard is visited by what appears to be his wife, who quickly feeds him the lies the Man in Black will later use to manipulate him. She then appears to flee as we hear the monster approaching. Another good example is what we see Echo experience in The Cost of Living. A wounded and dehydrated Echo sees apparitions of the men he killed off-island, as well as Yemi's former altar boy. There are a great many other potential examples of this, though most of them are more open to debate whether or not they actually were the Man in Black. But rest assured, I will be addressing every one of them in upcoming videos dedicated to exploring all of the mysterious dreams and apparitions that occur throughout the series and assessing the likelihood of whether or not the Man in Black was responsible for each of them. There's one more aspect to the nature of the monster that I wanted to talk about. One that I feel often goes overlooked. In the Season 3 episode, Left Behind, as Smokey approaches Kate and Juliet, we see two separate clouds of black smoke merge into one before crashing into the sonic fence and splitting apart again. potential implications of this are quite interesting. But given that there aren't an abundance of examples in which we know the man in black is in two places at once, it's likely this ability is fairly limited. The few times the man in black does seem to appear in more than one form at a time, such as the Echo and Richard examples brought up earlier, and what Hurley sees in the cabin, may also simply be explained by him mentally projecting what they're experiencing in their mentally vulnerable states. Taking these things into account, I am of the belief that when the man in black is in his true smoke form, in other words, when he is not replicating solid matter, he is capable of shedding and accumulating matter into his mass. Consider the many times we see him immediately after he materializes. He always has inanimate objects on him, such as clothing, backpacks, weapons, etc. This tells us the man in black can also disassemble the inorganic material in his vicinity, carry it with him as part of his smoke form, and then reassemble it either the way he found it or as part of another form. What I do not believe he can do is split his consciousness into separately autonomous entities. This would mean he is not capable of taking more than one corporeal form at a time. Instead, I believe there is always a centralized consciousness that is the man in black, while the pieces he separates from himself work as subconscious satellites of the main entity. I think this is a crucial component in how things such as the summoning chamber, the temple spring, and the infection in general all work. By leaving a small amount of himself in the summoning pool, he could then sense when it was drained and decide to heed the call. I believe he did the same thing to the spring, but to a larger degree, when the Egyptians first built the temple. However, when the Society of the Others first formed and began using the temple, I believe Jacob began keeping this darkness at bay. That is, until his death, at which point it re-emerged. And that is essentially what I think the infection is. I think a separated piece of the smoke monster enters a mortally wounded host in the process of healing them, after which it begins to grow inside of them and compel their behavior in a way that serves the man in black's interests. This, of course, leads us once again to the upcoming video all about the infection, including the confirmed cases we know of and the potential cases we might have missed. As for today's video, I think that about covers it. Until next time, namaste and good luck. Oh, you're still here. Hopefully that means you enjoyed this video. If so, please consider sticking around and being a constant for this channel by clicking right up here to subscribe. And don't forget to hit the bell icon if you would like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive. In the meantime, feel free to check out previous content from this channel by clicking here or here. Oh no. Please subscribe.